7 abandoned children, a dying ranch, and a battle against the powerful to claim a place they dared to call home. This isn't just a tale from the Old West. It's a fight for survival, belonging, and a future built from nothing. Stay with us, because what begins in the dust ends in something unforgettable. It wasn't a scream or a cry that marked the day Rachel Carter's childhood ended. It was silence. Thick, dusty, absolute silence. The kind that falls when the rattle of wagon wheels fades into nothing, and the dust they've kicked up settles around you like a shroud. That morning, the Carter family ceased to exist as it had for years. Eli and Joanne rode away, not looking back, leaving behind 7 children in the middle of the New Mexico desert with only a cracked canteen, a threadbare baby blanket, and a world of unanswered questions. Rachel stood still as the wind hissed through the desert sage. Baby Ellie whimpered in her arms. 6-year-old Danny sniffled beside her. 15-year-old Sam clenched his jaw and turned toward the horizon, as if daring it to offer a better answer than the one they'd just been given. Rachel didn't speak. Her voice had shriveled with disbelief. This wasn't the kind of heartbreak that made noise. It was the kind that sunk in slow, like rot in a tree. Rachel felt it in her knees first. They didn't want to hold her. But Ellie's warm breath on her collarbone reminded her that she didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Not now. Maybe not ever again. She turned toward the road, if you could call it that, and nodded once, sharp and quiet. "We walk," she said. "To where?" Sam asked, eyes still on the path their parents had taken. "Santa Fe," she said. "We find people, we find work, we stay alive." The journey began like most things in the West, with heat and dust and no guarantees. The children staggered through hours of open sun, the kind that made even the sky seem cruel. Every mile brought questions they didn't dare ask aloud. What if no one helps us? What if Ellie gets sick? What if this road just ends in more dust? They passed a signpost, half rotted and slumped sideways. The letters were too faded to read, but Rachel recognized the landmark, a trading post, long abandoned, half a day's walk from town. She remembered coming here once when she was 9, riding in the back of their wagon while her mother bartered cornmeal for nails. Back then, her father had laughed easily, told stories about Comanche ghosts and buried gold. Her mother wore ribbons in her hair. There'd been hope in their voices. Not anymore. They reached the trading post at dusk. The building was sagging like it had sighed and never stopped. Rachel pushed the door open. It moaned, a sound too human for comfort. Inside, the air was stale and thick with memories. They settled in the shadows. The floor creaked under each step. She laid Ellie on a folded blanket in the corner. The baby's eyelids fluttered, but she didn't cry. The others huddled together, grateful for a roof, even one full of holes. Rachel sat near the door, watching the horizon until the last light bled out of the sky. They didn't speak. Words felt too fragile, like glass in a freight wagon. When Sam finally broke the silence, his voice was raw. "They're not coming back, are they?" Rachel didn't answer. She just shook her head. A long pause followed. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we clean up. We walk into town looking like people, not ghosts. We find a way." Sam didn't respond. But after a while he moved closer to Ellie and tucked the blanket around her more tightly. In the stillness, Rachel let herself remember one last time. Her mother's lullabies, her father's Sunday sermons, the sound of Ellie's first laugh. She let it all come in like wind through the broken windows. Then she buried it beneath the weight of what came next. Outside, the stars ignited across the mesa sky, brilliant, unreachable, and watching. And beneath them, 7 children clung to the last thing they had left: each other. The town of Santa Fe greeted them with eyes that did not see. Behind curtained windows and half-open doors, the people of the town glanced, assessed, and turned away. They had seen hard times before, but a group of children walking barefoot into town, led by a girl who barely looked old enough to vote, that was a sight most didn't want to make sense of. Rachel Carter walked at the front, her chin held high not out of pride but necessity. The dust on her dress matched the tone of her skin. Her arms ached from carrying Ellie, but she dared not put the baby down. Sam walked beside her, taller now it seemed, though that might have just been the weight on his shoulders straightening his spine. The others followed behind in a line of silence, moving more like echoes than children. They passed the old mission chapel, where tourists snapped photographs of adobe walls and children begged for coins just beyond the camera's edge. But the Carter siblings didn't beg, not because they weren't hungry, but because Rachel refused to let desperation turn them invisible. The sheriff passed them once without stopping. A preacher nodded from his steps but offered no food, no shelter. At the general store, Rachel asked if there was any work. The clerk, a woman with tight lips and a tighter apron, looked over her shoulder at the children and said, "I'm sorry, miss. There's hardly enough for folks that live here." She left without a word. That evening, they found a small alley behind the smithy where the sun didn't reach and collapsed. Ellie whimpered. Danny whimpered louder. Rachel dug into her satchel and found the last piece of dry bread from 2 nights before. She broke it into pieces and handed them out like communion. "I'm not hungry," Lucy whispered, holding her share but not eating. "You're lying," Rachel said softly, "but I'm proud of you." Later, Sam rose before dawn and offered to muck stalls at the stable. "For food," he told the old man, who looked him up and down and said, "Ain't charity?" Sam didn't answer. He worked until his hands bled. Rachel spent the days going door to door. She found one woman who let her wash clothes for an apple. Another allowed her to scrub floors. A cook at a saloon tossed her leftover stew in a bucket and waved her off without a word. At night, she counted their gains: a crust of bread, a bruised pear, 2 cents, 1 bar of soap. Not enough. Never enough. The children didn't complain. Lucy drew pictures in the dirt with a stick. Lila helped Ellie walk in circles, steadying her sister's small steps. Danny kept saying he was going to build a house from leftover bricks he found behind the church. Rachel watched them and wondered when children learned to stop asking for more than they had, and how long it would be before these children did too. On their 4th day in town, something shifted. Rachel stepped into a sewing shop run by a woman with silver hair and stern hands. The woman glanced at her calloused fingers and said, "You stitch?" Rachel nodded. "You'll come tomorrow." It was the first time in days someone had told her what to do without suspicion. She worked quietly, her needle steady, her posture proud. The shopkeeper gave her a small basket of biscuits and a worn shawl at the end of the day. "Take care of your family," she said, "but don't get used to kindness." Rachel nodded. She already hadn't. That night, they shared those biscuits like they were gold. Danny cried when his was gone. Rachel gave him half of hers. They were surviving, barely. Each day, another thread pulled taut across a life too fragile to bear much weight. On the 5th morning, the children returned from the public well with a small tin pail of water and wide eyes. "There's a man," Lucy said, "with a horse. He asked about us." Rachel's heart skipped. "What man?" "I don't know, but he said something about a ranch." That night, Rachel lay awake with Ellie curled against her chest. The baby's breath was shallow but steady. The fever from the day before had cooled, and the cough had subsided. But for how long? She stared at the stars, wondering what it would take to turn survival into living, wondering if such a thing was even possible. In the darkness, her jaw clenched and a promise formed. They would not die in the cracks of someone else's story. They would write their own. And if the man with the horse could help them do that, she would listen. Just before sleep took her, Rachel whispered into Ellie's ear, "We are not done, not by a long stretch." The man on the horse came back the next morning. He rode in quietly, as if he'd already learned not to startle people who lived on the edge of fear. Rachel saw him before the others and stepped in front of her siblings, heart thumping. Her first instinct was always to protect, but something about the way he tipped his hat, not with pity but with recognition, made her pause. "My name's Mateo Alvarez," he said, dismounting slowly. "I own a bit of land a few miles north of here, a ranch." He nodded toward the tin pail by their makeshift camp. "You folks look like you could use more than well water." Rachel didn't answer right away. She scanned his hands, work-worn, weathered like hers. Not soft, not dangerous. She glanced at Sam, who was already on his feet, tense. Rachel stepped closer. "We're not looking for charity." "I'm not offering it," Mateo said. "There's always work to be done. You help me, I help you, fair deal." And just like that, they followed him. 7 children behind a stranger on horseback, leaving behind the cracked streets of Santa Fe for a place they hadn't dared imagine. Rancho Esperanza wasn't what Rachel expected. She thought of ranches as dry, lonely places, but Mateo's land sat nestled in a lush bend of the valley, where cottonwoods lined a stream and wildflowers dared to bloom. There were chickens and goats, 2 tired but sturdy horses, and a small adobe house with a porch shaded by a vine-covered trellis. It smelled like life. Earth and water and wood smoke. Inside the house they met Doña Isabela, Mateo's aunt, with hair like snow and a gaze that could freeze or warm you, depending on what she saw. She said little at first, but handed Rachel a bowl of warm soup, gently took Ellie from her arms and motioned toward the bed. "Child's sick," she murmured, but not lost. That night, Rachel lay beside her siblings on pallets of blankets in the barn's loft. The roof above them was patched but solid. The scent of hay and safety mingled in her lungs. Ellie's breathing was clearer. Sam slept with his hand on a rake handle like a soldier with a rifle. Danny clutched a wooden block someone had carved into a toy horse. For the first time in weeks, Rachel allowed herself to cry. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Mateo rose before dawn to tend to the animals, and Sam went with him. Rachel helped Doña Isabela in the kitchen and garden. Lucy and Lila fed the chickens and learned to collect eggs without breaking them. Danny became the official goat chaser, a title he bore with pride. Ellie, with time and warmth and proper food, began to smile again. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about learning how to live. Mateo taught Sam to ride, not just in circles but over rough hills and through dry riverbeds. "A man doesn't ride a horse with his legs," he said. "He rides with his heart. The horse just follows." Sam listened, and something softened in him each time he returned to the barn. Doña Isabela introduced Rachel to a world she'd never known. Herbs that could heal wounds and calm fevers, stories from Pueblo tradition about fire and spirit, and the quiet strength of women who built homes with their hands and hearts. They shared meals by candlelight and spoke of nothing and everything. Rachel learned to cook beans the slow way, to knead bread until her arms ached, to listen for the wind and predict a storm. It was healing, but it wasn't magic. The children still flinched at loud noises. Ellie still cried out in her sleep. Rachel still woke each morning with a moment of panic, expecting it all to be gone. One afternoon, while mending a torn curtain, Rachel looked out the window and saw Ellie in Mateo's arms. He was pointing at the sky, explaining something about clouds and rain. The baby leaned her head against his shoulder like she belonged there. And maybe she did. Later that evening, Doña Isabela pulled Rachel aside. "You don't owe us your story," she said gently, "but I know the weight of holding it alone." Rachel hesitated. Then she told her about Eli and Joanne, about the night on the road, about bread broken like communion in alleyways and the promise she whispered under the stars. Doña Isabela didn't interrupt. When Rachel finished, she simply took her hands and said, "Then let this be the next chapter, not the end." Rachel wanted to believe her. But shadows don't vanish just because you walk into the sun, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew the peace of Rancho Esperanza was temporary. Still, for now, there were eggs to collect, goats to feed, and stories to share by firelight. And for the first time, Rachel let herself think. Maybe, just maybe, they had found a place worth staying in long enough to hope again. The first sign came not with words, but with a shadow. It fell across the valley one crisp afternoon as Rachel gathered herbs in the garden. A lone rider stood on the ridge, unmoving, his silhouette black against the sun. She froze. Something about his stillness was different from Mateo's quiet calm. This was a presence meant to be seen. By the time she called for Mateo, the rider was gone. But shadows don't vanish, they simply shift. That evening, Mateo returned from the trading post with a look that made Rachel's stomach clench. He said little at first, only that an old neighbor had spoken of trouble. That certain men, wealthy ranchers from the north, were claiming the landlines around Rancho Esperanza had never been properly marked. That they were talking of legal rights and deeds, courtrooms and fences. "Why now?" Rachel asked. "Because we made this place too visible," Mateo replied. "We gave it life again." She wanted to protest. They'd done nothing wrong. But Mateo just looked toward the barn, where Sam was brushing down the horses, and the twins were laughing over a spilled bucket of feed. He didn't need to say more. Sometimes hope itself makes you a target. Days passed. More riders came. Sometimes they didn't dismount. Sometimes they did, leaving muddy boot prints on the porch as they handed Mateo folded letters with language too polished to be honest. Sheriff Walt Harlan arrived 2 weeks later. He removed his hat and stood with a kind of weariness that didn't belong to his years. "Word's spreading," he said. "There's talk of eviction, land surveys, allegations, the kind of noise rich men stir up when they smell opportunity." Rachel stiffened. "We belong here." Walt sighed. "You and I know that, but men with money, they see maps, not people." She wanted to ask him to fight, to stop them. But she remembered the way her father used to speak of the law, not as protection, but as a door some could walk through, and others could not. That night, she sat with Mateo on the porch. Sam had gone quiet again, his shoulders hunched with questions no boy should carry. Rachel picked at a splinter in the railing. "They'll take this from us, won't they?" "Only if we let them," Mateo said. So they didn't. Rachel returned to town the next day, not to beg, but to organize. She wrote letters by lantern light, her pen shaking from exhaustion but never hesitation. She walked door to door, gathering signatures, telling neighbors the story of the children, of the kindness shown and the peace they'd found. Some people looked away, but others, Mrs. Juniper, a widow who had once wept over Rachel's laundry, Mr. Singh, the blacksmith who had given Sam a new bridle, stood up. Sam repaired fences as if he were building a fortress. Lucy and Lila made drawings for neighbors, simple scenes of the ranch. Chickens, goats, Ellie's smile. Each picture left behind like a seed of empathy. Even Danny helped, handing out flyers and recounting the story of the barn that held our dreams. Rachel visited Father Joseph at the mission. He offered to speak on their behalf. "You've done more good here in months than some do in lifetimes," he said. Still, there were nights when Rachel could barely hold the fear inside. She'd step outside, look up at the stars, and feel the sky pressing down. Her hands would tremble, not from weakness, but from the weight of having something to lose. One evening, she returned from town to find Ellie asleep on Mateo's lap, clutching his thumb. The baby had stopped crying in her sleep. She had stopped waiting for someone to come rescue her, because she had already been saved. Rachel knelt beside them, brushing a curl from Ellie's face. "She called you Papa today," she whispered. Mateo's eyes shimmered in the lantern light, but he said nothing. In the days that followed, Rachel watched as people began to speak differently. The ranch wasn't just theirs anymore. It belonged to the community that believed in it. People brought pies and bread, lent tools, and offered rides. Neighbors who once averted their eyes now tipped their hats. But the legal hearing loomed. A date was set. Papers were served, and still, Mateo held his ground. "Truth," he told Rachel, "isn't about who shouts loudest. It's about who keeps standing when the shouting stops." And so they stood, together. Rachel held Ellie one evening, standing beneath the cottonwoods. The air was warm, the sky streaked with pink and gold. She whispered a promise to the baby, to Sam, to herself. "We don't run anymore." Behind her, Rancho Esperanza glowed with candlelight and defiance. The storm was coming, but this time they were ready to meet it. They say, when justice finally comes, it walks with quiet feet, but no one tells you how loud your own heartbeat will be while you wait. The morning of the hearing, the Carter children rose before the sun. Rachel dressed Ellie in the cleanest dress they had, one Doña Isabela had mended by hand. Sam wore the shirt Mateo had given him, and though it was too big, he stood straighter in it. Lucy and Lila held hands, and Danny carried the drawing he had made of the ranch, his imagined fortress of safety. The courthouse in Santa Fe was not grand. It was weathered, with squeaky floors and dusty corners. But to Rachel, it might as well have been a fortress. They sat together in the front row. Rachel, Sam, Lucy, Lila, Danny, Ellie, and Mateo. They were not a traditional family, not by blood or law, but they were a family by every measure that mattered. The judge was a tall man with tired eyes, the kind that had seen both injustice and redemption. He listened first to the lawyers of the syndicate, the men who came in polished boots and silk ties, their voices smooth as river stones. They spoke of deeds and surveys, of ownership and boundaries, of lost paperwork and profits. They questioned Mateo's records, challenged the informal guardianship of the children, and painted a picture of a squatter family on borrowed land. Rachel could feel the room pulling toward them, the way gravity pulls toward weight. These men had power, they had money, they had arguments crafted with care and confidence. Then it was Rachel's turn. She didn't stand behind the podium, she stood beside Ellie's stroller. She placed Danny's drawing on the judge's desk. "My name is Rachel Carter," she began, her voice soft but steady. "We came to Rancho Esperanza with nothing. Not because we were lazy, but because we were left. Left behind by those who should have stayed. We survived because someone offered a hand instead of a question." She told them about the walk through the desert, about sleeping in alleys, about finding safety under Mateo's roof. She didn't beg, she didn't accuse. She simply told the truth, as one does when there's no more room for anything else. She spoke of Ellie's fever and how Doña Isabela's herbs healed her, of how Sam learned to ride with dignity and not fear, of the laughter that returned to their lives. Others spoke after her. Mrs. Juniper, with her trembling hands, told how the children brought her pies when her leg was bad. Mr. Singh described how Sam helped mend tools before sunrise. Father Joseph talked of redemption. Sheriff Harlan stepped forward too, slow and deliberate. "Rancho Esperanza is more than land," he said. "It's proof that something good can grow where the world once gave up." There was a moment of silence so complete it felt like the building had exhaled. The judge closed his notebook and looked at them for a long time. "I've reviewed the claims," he said. "But claims are only half the story. This court recognizes that property can be measured in feet and inches, but a home is measured in heart." He turned to Mateo. "Mr. Alvarez, you retain legal stewardship of Rancho Esperanza. Furthermore, your guardianship of the Carter children is officially recognized by this court." Gasps escaped. Rachel didn't cry, but her knees nearly gave out. Mateo caught her, steady and warm. The children clung to each other, eyes wide with something they hadn't fully known before: security. Later that day, they returned to the ranch not as squatters, not as fugitives from circumstance, but as a family. The sun seemed to shine a little brighter. The chickens clucked louder. The porch creaked in welcome. That night, they celebrated with tamales and dancing. Doña Isabela sang a song from her childhood. Sam lifted Danny onto his shoulders. Lucy and Lila drew pictures of a courthouse wrapped in vines and flowers. Ellie fell asleep with a smile on her face, clutching a wooden spoon like it was treasure. The stars blinked into the sky as if to witness the rebirth of something old made new. Rachel sat alone by the garden fence, looking out at the land that had once seemed too good to be true. She thought of all the times she'd wanted to give up, of the shadows they'd walked through, of the day she watched her parents disappear into the distance. She remembered the weight of responsibility, the long nights without answers, the fear she wore like a second skin. She realized something then. This story hadn't been about running from what was behind them. It had always been about building something ahead. Every step, every scar, every tear had led them here. Mateo joined her quietly, handing her a blanket. "You did it?" he said. "No," Rachel replied, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "We did it, all of us." He nodded. "You know, I've worked this land for years, thought I knew every inch, but it didn't become home until you arrived." Rachel looked up at the sky, endless and forgiving. "You think the sky knows who we are?" she asked. "I think it remembers the ones who don't give up," he said. She smiled, brushing a curl from her forehead. "We belong to this place," she whispered. "And maybe, just maybe, it belongs to us too." Above them, the stars began to blink awake, and beneath that vast eternal sky, the Carter children, no longer just survivors, became something more. They became legends of their own making, not for what they had lost, but for what they chose to build. There are stories we tell to remember who we are, and then there are stories we live, gritty, raw, shaped by hardship and heart, that remind us who we can become. The tale of Rachel Carter and her siblings isn't just a dusty Western narrative stitched with hardship. It's a testament to what happens when hope meets grit, and when ordinary people refuse to break under extraordinary pressure. From the scorched desert roads of abandonment to the courthouse steps of redemption, the Carter children and those who stood beside them offered more than resilience. They offered us a mirror. We see in them not just survival, but the fierce beauty of rebuilding from ruins, of choosing love over fear, and of planting roots even when the soil is uncertain. Rachel's journey teaches us that leadership doesn't wait for permission. It rises, quiet and determined, in the smallest of gestures: a shared crust of bread, a decision to keep walking, a promise whispered under the stars. Her courage wasn't loud, but it endured. And in a world where families are often defined by bloodlines, she redefined it through action, sacrifice, and love. Mateo Alvarez showed us that kindness isn't weakness, that the true power of land isn't in the deed that claims it, but in the community it nurtures. His ranch, once a solitary place, became a sanctuary because he dared to open its gates to those in need. In doing so, he proved that generosity can anchor the displaced and that home is something we can build together. Doña Isabela reminded us that age doesn't diminish purpose. With her wisdom, she healed more than fevers. She restored faith. She carried history in her hands and passed it on not through lectures, but through stories, food, and the calming rhythm of tradition. Through her, we're reminded that the oldest voices often carry the deepest truths. This story is also a tribute to the unseen. The Mrs. Junipers, the Mr. Sings, the sheriffs and shopkeepers who quietly choose compassion over indifference. In a time when so many feel unseen and unheard, these characters remind us that every gesture counts, and that even in silence, solidarity speaks volumes. But perhaps most importantly, the story of Rancho Esperanza whispers a truth that echoes beyond its fences, that what you build matters more than what you've lost. That legacy isn't forged in comfort. It's carved out of pain, persistence, and purpose. In the end, we are all, in some way, walking our own desert road, facing abandonment, injustice, fear. But Rachel's voice reminds us, we don't run anymore. We stand, we rebuild, we choose the long way home, if it's the only one that leads to something real. So if this story moved you, inspired you, made you feel something stir beneath the surface, hold on to that. Let it guide your choices. Let it remind you of your strength. Let it show you that no matter how far you've fallen, it is still possible to rise and make a life that is not only yours, but a light for others. And if you believe in stories like this, stories of courage, compassion, and transformation, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep these stories alive, helps us share more tales that speak to the heart, and gives us the strength to keep riding into the unknown, uncovering the legends that deserve to be heard. This isn't the end. It's only the beginning. Thank you for being here. Finally, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and support our channel. Your encouragement gives us the motivation to continue bringing you more meaningful, inspiring stories like this one. Together, let's keep the spirit of the Old West alive, one legend at a time.